In today's world of super sophisticated cyber attacks, it's easy to think the biggest threats come from shadowy, state-sponsored groups. But sometimes the most damaging breach doesn't start with a complex piece of code, but with a simple act of betrayal. Today, we are diving deep into one of those moments from the early days of the internet, the great AOL breach. To really get a handle on just how big this story is, let's start with a number, a truly staggering number: 7 billion. That's right, 7 billion spam messages flooded people's inboxes, all stemming from one single data breach. And here's the kicker. The person responsible wasn't some external hacker, it was an insider. So, how did this even happen? Well, it all boils down to one person, a trusted employee right at the heart of the company, who made the choice to become an outlaw. These are the actual words of Jason Smothers, a software engineer at America Online, AOL. And he wasn't just admitting to what he did, he was literally describing his own transformation in what he saw as the Wild West of the early internet. See, Smathers wasn't what you'd call a master hacker. In today's cybersecurity lingo, he was something called a trusted collaborator. And that's a threat that doesn't need to break down the door from the outside because they already have a key. It's all about exploiting the human element, the trust a company puts in its people. And his reason for doing it? It wasn't some grand political statement or corporate espionage. Nope. It was, in his own words, about easy money through the internet. This case was a real turning point, where we see the motivation for insider threats shift from ideology to just plain old cash. So, for betraying millions of customers and pulling off one of the biggest data thefts of his time, how much did Jason Smathers get paid? You're not going to believe this. Just $28,000. Okay, so how did he do it? How did one guy cause so much chaos? The method was way simpler and, honestly, a lot more frightening than you'd probably imagine. He didn't write some brilliant piece of malware. He didn't find some secret backdoor. He literally just used a coworker's password to get into AOL's customer database. That's it. It was an incredibly low-tech move for such a high-impact crime. And with that one password, that single act of credential abuse, he got the keys to the entire kingdom. He didn't just grab a little data. He stole the screen names of 92 million customers. That was basically everyone on AOL. Smathers took that list and sold it to a spammer, who immediately started using it to push an online gambling site. But, it did not stop there. That spammer turned around and resold the list to other people for as much as $52,000. Weaponizing that stolen data again and again. This really puts the domino effect into perspective, doesn't it? A tiny $28,000 payout leads to 92 million compromised accounts, which then unleashes that flood of 7 billion spam emails. It just completely shattered the trust people had in their own digital space. As you can imagine, the fallout from a breach this huge didn't stay online for long. It spilled right into the courtroom, and in the process, it ended up setting a major legal precedent for the digital age. So here's where the timing gets really interesting. Smathers was arrested just a few months after a brand new law called the Can-Spam Act was put into effect. That meant his case became the very first major test for this huge piece of anti-spam legislation. Now, the legal fight was tricky. To make the Can-Spam charges stick, the court said prosecutors had to prove his actions were deceptive, not just to AOL, but to the millions of people who actually received the spam. The case also set a wild new precedent for paying damages, basically flipping the whole thing on its head and making Smathers prove what the financial damages should be. So, okay, this all happened a couple of decades ago. Why are we still talking about it? What is the big lesson from this one story of betrayal that still matters so much today? After 2 decades of unbelievable technological progress, what do you think is still the weakest link in all of cybersecurity? Well, the answer, frustratingly, hasn't changed one bit. The human element. The Smothers attack wasn't a failure of firewalls. It wasn't a failure of encryption. It was, at its core, a failure of trust. It was a perfect, if painful, demonstration that our own behavior is almost always the biggest vulnerability in any system. This whole case just highlights these timeless truths that are, frankly, even more important now. It proved that your security is only ever as strong as your least security-conscious person, and that exploiting trust from the inside can be so much more devastating than a fancy attack from the outside. And that really leaves us with one final, kind of provocative thought. Back then, the vulnerability was a simple password shared between two coworkers. It really makes you stop and think. As our technology gets more and more complicated, what simple, fundamental trusts are we misplacing today?